Good day to Teresa and everyone. So my name is Yap Hui Sin and my other group mate. Today we'll present our IHL topic, which is the Russia-Ukraine conflict after the 2022 escalations. So now let's moving to introductions. So on February 24, 2022, Russia launched a full-scale military invasion of Ukraine, causing a catastrophic escalation of long-standing regional tensions. The initial months alone triggered an immense humanitarian crisis, forcing over 4 million civilians to flee their homes. So, looking at where we stand today in 2026, the combined military casualties are projected to approach nearly 2 million. What was initially anticipated by many to be a swift campaign has instead evolved into a brutal, technologically complex war of attrition, severely training Russia war economic. Against this backdrop, our paper core objective is to critically evaluate how effectively the foundational IHL are being respected in this theater of war. Now, let's look at the conflict background and how is it classified under international law. The principal belligerents are the Russia Federation as the attacking state and Ukraine, which is exercising its inherent rights to self-defense under Article 51 of the UN Charter. However, the battlefield is highly complex involving various proxies and non-state actors such as Russia-backed proxies in Donetsk and Luhansk, the Wagner Group, and the Ukraine's International Legion, legally because both states maintain command and control over these irregular foes, their actions are attributed directly to their respective state under IHL. Crucially, under Common Article 2 of the Geneva Conventions, a formal declaration of war isn't needed to activate international law. The moment large-scale military forces were deployed, these situations were legally classified as an international armed conflict (IIC). This specific classification is wider because it triggers the absolute applications of 1949 Geneva Conventions and the additional Protocol 1, binding both sides to strict principle of distinctions, proportionality, and military necessity that concludes the background and legal framework of the conflict. So now I will hand over the floor to my group mate for next sessions. Thank you.
So now I'll be presenting part 3, which is the critical analysis of the principle of distinction in the Russia-Ukraine war post-2022. Under Article 48 of Additional Protocol 1, parties to a conflict must always distinguish between civilians and combatants, as well as civilian and military targets. For an object to be a lawful target under Article 52, Paragraph 2, it must effectively contribute to military action, and its destruction must offer a definite military advantage. If there's stop, infrastructure like schools or residential blocks must be presumed civilian. In this conflict, distinction is heavily tested by dual-use infrastructure, like power grids. Starting in October 2022, Russia systematically targeted Ukraine's energy grid, arguing it powered military logistics. However, this strategy caused rolling blackouts that crippled civilian survival systems, such as winter heating and hospitals. In contrast, we see localized tactical compliances when forces restrict target choices to direct threats. For example, the June 2024 precision strikes on Russia air defense batteries in Belgorod neutralized an active combat capability, clearly satisfying both the definition of a military objective and international humanitarian law. Legally, treating an entire national energy grid as a single military target fundamentally undermines the principle of distinction. Adding to this legal dilemma is the rise of digital participatory warfare. When ordinary citizens use smartphone apps to report enemy movements, they become integrated into military networks. This hyper-digitalized mobilization blurs the binary line between civilian and combatant, making target verification extremely difficult. In summary, the principle of distinction faces intense dual pressure. offensively through the broad targeting of civilian infrastructure, and defensively through the in, in and defensively through the institutionalization of civilian digital warfare. Thank you.
Hi everyone, introducing me myself, Yuvadarshini Vyasa, and today I'll be presenting about the critical analysis. The principle of proportionality is one of the fundamental rules of international humanitarian law and is codified under Article 51.5p of Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions. This principle does not prohibit all civilian casualties. Instead, it prohibits attacks where the expected civilian harm is excessive in relation to the anticipated concrete and also the direct military advantage. Importantly, proportionality is assessed before an attack is launched based on the information reasonably available to the military commanders at that time. This is also known as an ex ante assessment. The Russia Ukraine conflict demonstrates the challenges of applying this principle during urban warfare. In Mariupol, prolonged bombardments destroyed hospitals, residential buildings, and civilian shelters, making civilian casualties highly foreseeable. In Kharkiv, repeated shelling with explosive weapons caused widespread destruction of civilian infrastructure. The Battle of Bakhmut also illustrates proportionality concerns, as months of fighting produced only limited territorial gains while leaving the city almost completely destroyed. These are the examples that highlight the legal difficulty of balancing military objectives with civilian protection during the modern armed conflict. Now let us move to the next part. Applying proportionality during the urban warfare is extremely complex. In IHL, military commanders must estimate collateral damage by considering civilian presence, weapon accuracy, blast radius, and also the environmental condition. These assessments become far more difficult in densely populated cities where the civilians and military objectives are often located close together. Although Ukrainian forces sometimes operated from civilian areas, international humanitarian law makes it clear that does not remove the attacker's obligation to comply with proportionality. Instead, the attacking force must take feasible precautions such as using precision guided weapons or canceling attacks if excessive civilian is armed and is expected. A balanced legal analysis also requires considering both perspectives. In this matter, Russia argues that many attacks targeted legitimate military objectives and were justified by military necessity. However, reports from international organizations indicate extensive civilian casualties, where destruction of hospitals, schools, and also the residential area. Where military gains appear limited but civilian harm is widespread, the legality of those attacks become highly questionable under Article 51.5b. In conclusion, the Russia-Ukraine war demonstrates the significant challenges of applying the principle of proportionality in modern urban warfare. While military necessity is recognized under international humanitarian law, it cannot justify excessive civilian war. Strengthening compliance, improving targeting practices, and also enhancing transparency are essential to uphold the humanitarian purpose of international humanitarian law. In conclusion, the principle of proportionality does not prevent military operations, but it ensures that even during war, the protection of civilians remains a fundamental legal obligation. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Nur Fatina Fifa binti Aksan. So, moving on to the critical analysis of civilian protection and humanitarian access in the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Under Geneva Convention 4, civilians must be protected from violence, intimidation, collective punishment, and forced displacement. Occupying powers are also required to ensure access to food, healthcare, and other essential services. However, the destruction of homes, hospitals, and water systems throughout the conflict shows a significant gap between legal obligation and realities on the ground. This highlights how military objectives often take precedence over humanitarian considerations. Next, another important issue is the use of humanitarian corridors. These corridors were established to allow civilians to evacuate safely and to, and to facilitate the delivery of humanitarian aid. However, many operations were disrupted by ceasefire violation and ongoing hostilities. The failed evacuation of civilians from Mariupol in March 2022 demonstrates how humanitarian efforts depend heavily on cooperation and trust between the parties involved. In addition, restrictions on humanitarian aid have limited access to food, clean water, and medical supplies. Under IHL, these essential resources and facilities are protected because they are indispensable to civilian survival. Therefore, the main challenge in this conflict is not the absence of legal rules, but the lack of compliance and enforcement. Ultimately, Ultimately, the effectiveness of IHL depends on accountability and the political commitment of all parties to respect humanitarian principles. That's all from me. Thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Saliha binti Matsal and my metric number is BA23110059. Next, I will be presenting on the topic Institutional Response and Enforcement Mechanism, focusing on the roles of the International Committee of the Red Cross ICRC as well as international judicial bodies such as the International Criminal Court ICC and the International Court of Justice ICJ. ICRC was established in 1863 as an independent and neutral humanitarian organization. It is not part of any state under UN. Instead, it acts as a neutral intermediary in armed conflicts. Its foundation is closely linked to Henry Dunant and the 1864 Geneva Convention, which aim to protect victims of war. One of the main roles of the ICRC is monitoring the treatment and conditions of POW. The organization visits detention facilities, interviews detainees, and ensures that prisoners are treated humanly. It also works to protect them from torture or any form of abuse and provides access to medical care. However, its effectiveness depends heavily on cooperation from the parties involved in the conflict. In addition, the ICRC plays an important humanitarian role in facilitating the repatriation of human remains and helping to trace missing persons during armed conflicts. This is crucial in helping families find closure and understand the fate of their loved ones. However, the ICRC also faces several challenges, including restricted access to conflict zones, security risks, lack of cooperation from conflicting parties, and the large number of missing person cases. This limitation reduce its ability to fully carry out its humanitarian mission. Moving on to international judicial security, the ICJ became involved when Ukraine brought a case against Russia under the Genocide Convention of 1940. Russia claimed that its military actions were aimed at preventing genocide. However, the ICJ issued provisional measure ordering both parties to avoid actions that could escalate or prolong the conflict. Despite this, the conflict has continued, highlighting the limited enforcement power of ICJ. At the same time, ICC opened an active investigation into the Russia-Ukraine conflict following referrals from several states. The ICC focused on alleged war crime and violations of IHL. In some cases, individuals have also been pursued under universal jurisdictions in domestic courts. Both the ICC and ICJ provide important mechanisms for accountability and help document violations of international law. However, their effectiveness is limited by several challenges, including slow investigative process, dependence on state cooperation, and the lack of direct enforcement power over their decisions. In conclusion, both the ICRC and international judicial institutions such as the ICC and ICJ play vital roles in promoting humanitarian protection and accountability during armed conflicts. However, their effectiveness remains constrained by practical and political limitations. Firstly, the principle of distinction requires parties in a conflict to differentiate between military targets and civilian objects. However, in this conflict, attack on Ukraine energy infrastructure raised concern because they significantly affected civilian access to electricity, water, and healthcare service. At the same time, there were also instances where attack, attacks were directed at legitimate military targets, showing partial attempts to comply with this principle. Secondly, the principle of proportionality was heavily challenged, especially in cities such as Mariupol, Kharkiv, and Bakhmut. International law states that civilian harm excessive compared to the expected military advantage. However, the use of heavy explosive weapons in populated areas increased civilians' casualties and raised concern about whether proper proportionality assessments were carried out. Thirdly, the protection of civilians remained a major issue throughout the conflict. Although humanitarian corridors were great, many were not fully effective due to ongoing fighting. In addition, restriction on humanitarian access and damage to civilian infrastructure further worsened civilian suffering. Overall, while international humanitarian law IHL provides clear legal principles, this conflict shows that their effectiveness depends heavily on whether parties choose to comply with them. In conclusion, despite violation and enforcement challenges, international humanitarian law (IHL) remains a crucial framework for regulating armed conflict and protecting human dignity. The existence of legal principles monitoring by humanitarian organizations and actions by international courts show that accountability mechanisms are still function. However, the Russia-Ukraine conflict also reveals structural weakness in enforcement. These include limited access for humanitarian actors, political obstacles obstacles and delays in international legal process. Therefore, stronger international cooperation, improved monitoring, and more effective accountability mechanisms are needed to ensure better protection of civilians in future conflicts. Overall, even though enforcement is imperfect, these challenges do not reduce the importance of IHL as an essential tool for maintaining humanity during war. That's all from our group. Thank you for your attention.